We've talked about how to set up a pantograph file within Quilt Path. Now let's take a look at how to actually stitch out the pantograph you've created. The first thing we'll need to do is open a pantograph layout file. From the main menu, tap on Pantograph in the Select and Sew menu. We need to navigate to the file where the pantograph layout file has been saved. I have placed the pantograph layout file we are going to use inside my Patterns folder, inside the Panto Layouts folder we created in the Easy Panto Stacker lesson. I'm going to stitch out a new Panto layout file for the quilt I have mounted on my frame. I'll select the file and tap on Open. Depending on what you were doing with your software prior to this, you may be asked to set your safe area. Follow the prompts to show Quilt Path where it is allowed to stitch on your table. Now, this looks familiar, right? We are in our basic Panto Stacker screen. That is because I created this layout in the basic Panto Stacker. If I'd created it in the easy mode or advanced mode, it would have opened in that mode. Let's stitch this Panto layout file out. Tap on Quilt as Rows. You'll see a progress screen as Quilt Path works to send your file to the placement screens. If you have a complicated pattern, it may take a few moments for Quilt Path to crunch all the information. This screen looks familiar too, right? It is very similar to the placement screen we saw in the lesson on how to place and sew block designs. The large area is our placement window, where we show Quilt Path where we want a design to stitch out. At the top left is the big red X, which would take us back to the Panto Stacker screen. There is a Save button, and next door to that is a button that will reverse the direction the pattern will stitch. So, in this case, I can see that the green button is on the left, which means my pantograph will stitch from left to right. If I wanted to stitch from right to left, I just tap the reverse button. Now I have my red stop button showing on the left, which means it will stitch from right to left. I'll tap again to reset it as I want to stitch this from left to right. Next to that button is the Settings menu button. Let's tap this button to see the choices we have in this menu. Here is where we can adjust the speed with which Quilt Path moves our machine. I generally like to keep it either on the turtle or the regular rabbit, and I set my APQS machine to about a 10. You'll want to go a bit slower on the designs with a lot of directional changes. I like my tie-off count to be about a 4. To change this, just tap on the tie-off button to toggle it to a 4. I like to keep the automatic bobbin pull selected when I'm stitching pantographs. Make sure the Pause at Trim Lines box is selected. What is a trim line? We'll look at some in a moment. Take a look at the pattern statistics listed to the right. It shows the height of my row, width of my row, even the number of stitches it will take to stitch out my pantograph. And it shows how many trims I have. Let's tap on OK to learn more about trim lines. The trim lines are shown in blue dots. They are called trim lines because Quilt Path trims the excess pattern away when it leaves the boundary of the quilt top area we've created inside the program. Those blue lines mark where Quilt Path will stop the normal path of stitching, and we need to tell it how to travel to the next section of the pattern it needs to stitch. Notice that I can also toggle whether Quilt Path shows the trim lines on this placement screen too, just by tapping the Show Trim button. My pantograph is offset, and each row wraps, so I have to tell Quilt Path what to do when it leaves the quilt space and needs to travel to the next entry point in my pattern. I want to have Quilt Path connect the exit and entry points on the edges of my quilt space with a straight line of stitching. To do this, I need to optimize my pattern. Tap the Optimize button. In the Optimize screen, we have a lot of control. Let's start on the lower left of the screen. The first button will reveal or hide the order with which Quilt Path will stitch out the pattern. Sometimes you might find it easier to tap this button and hide the sequence numbers as you double check that the pattern will stitch out as you choose. I'm going to uncheck this box so only the sequence number I'm inspecting will display. I can use the plus/minus buttons to display other portions of this row or pattern I'm about to stitch. By the way, if the location of the sequence number is in the way and you want to nudge it so you can peek behind it, use the arrows. They won't move the actual segment of the pattern, only the number label. Make sure you have the Show Trim Lines toggled so the green check mark is displayed. See those blue trim lines? Those are the ones I want to get rid of by making the machine take a continuous line of stitching between those 2 points. I'm going to tap on the Remove All button. A dialog button appears asking me if I want to join the start and end points. In this case, I don't want to because my start point is going to be on the far left side of this row and my stop point is going to be on the far right side of the row. If I said yes, I'd be asking for a big straight line to be stitched right through my row so Quilt Path could link up the tail with the head of my pattern. I'm going to tap on No. The next set of buttons will let me swap the direction the machine will take to stitch this pattern. On the left, I have a green dot designating my start position. On the right, I have a red dot showing my stop point. If I'd rather stitch this row out from right to left, I can tap on Reverse All. In this case, though, I do want to stitch this from left to right, so I'm going to tap again to put the green dot on the left. You'd use Reverse All on a pattern before removing all of the trim lines when you want every segment of a pattern stitched in the opposite direction in order to join the pattern so it will stitch out as one continuous line. Let's simulate the stitching path on the tablet to be sure it is going to stitch in the sequence we want. The Check for Breaks button has a green checkbox on it, so when we animate the stitching, it will show us if there is a break in the pattern. Let's put our speed on a 3 and tap Animate Pattern to watch the simulation of how this pattern will stitch. At the end, it will ask us if we want to connect the end point with the start point because we have the Check for Breaks box selected. I'll tap No. Looks pretty good, right? We are ready to tap on OK, but before we do that, let's take a look at some of the other buttons on the screen. In the upper left, you have your Undo, Redo buttons. There's a Save button, and the Reset button is a master undo that takes the entire pattern back to the way it was when we entered this screen. You've also got your Zoom controls to the right of that and your Help button. I'm going to tap on OK and position this first row to sew. Now that we've got our trim lines removed, we are ready to place the first row to stitch out. Think of each row of your pantograph as a box. We're going to be stacking boxes together to form the edge-to-edge pantograph pattern. To do this, we will use the placement buttons. The buttons with the yellow flags do not distort our box in any way. The pattern is laid down using either the upper left corner of the box, the top center of the box, or the top right corner of the box. Since most of the time I'll be stitching out left to right, I'll typically use the top left yellow flag button for the first row. First, move your machine to just above and just outside the upper left corner of your quilt top. Remember that we made our pantograph layout file just a bit bigger than our actual quilt to allow for any fullness the quilt top may have. That means our pattern is going to stitch slightly off the sides of our quilt. Now, tap the button that corresponds to this position. I'm using the top left corner of my quilt, so I'll tap the top left placement button with the yellow flag. Okay, now our row has been placed and is ready to sew. If the background of your placement screen is red, Quilt Path is alerting you that your row will not fit between the bars of your APQS quilting machine. To reset the safe area, tap on the toolbox and tap on Set Safe Area. Now that we've placed the first row, let's stitch it out. We need to pull the bobbin up to the top using the Pull Bobbin button. In my settings menu, I've asked Quilt Path to do an automatic bobbin pull. If you prefer to do your own bobbin pull, leave that setting unchecked. It is important when using Quilt Path to always keep your machine in the needle up position. If you need to re-pull your bobbin for any reason, just tap Redo. You can always use the button to either move your needle away or back to the starting position, or to take a single stitch. When you are ready, tap Sew. Quilt Path will take the number of stay stitches you've requested in the settings menu and will then stitch out the row. When Quilt Path completes the row, tap Finished, proceed to next row. You could also access the toolbox, settings menu, or repair pattern features here if needed. Take any tacking stitches now and cut your threads or knot and bury your thread tails if desired. Quilt Path will calculate if you have enough room in your safe area to stitch out another row. In my case, I do have enough room, so the dialog box says, "The next row has been placed and is ready to sew. You may adjust the placement if desired." Quilt Path has calculated that I have enough room for the next box or row of my pattern without needing to advance the fabric forward on my table. I'll tap on OK, and I'm taken back to the pattern placement screen in case I want to adjust where I'd like the next row to stitch. Notice that the background of my placement window is white, which is yet another way Quilt Path tells me I have plenty of space in my safe area to sew out my next row. I don't need to adjust anything for placement, I just need to sew the next row. However, I'm checking for blue lines to see if there's a trim line I need to optimize to remove. In this case, it all looks good, so I'm ready to stitch out this next row. By the way, if you didn't optimize and remove the trim lines, then Quilt Path would stop at each jump stitch and give you time to knot and bury your threads if desired, and use the Move to Next button to move to the next portion of the pantograph. I could tap on Trace to have Quilt Path move the machine along the stitching path without actually stitching, just to be sure everything is going to stitch where I expect it. Once this row is finished stitching, tap Finished Row, proceed to next row. Because I don't have enough room in the safe area to stitch another row, Quilt Path brings up an alert. The pattern is not within the safe area. The fabric will need to be scrolled. Notice also that the background of the screen is red to alert you that you must take action. It is time to advance my quilt. But first, I need to make a registration mark so I will know where to place my next row after I scroll my quilt. Tap on OK. Now, keep in mind, we are about to completely confuse Quilt Path. We are going to move the quilt sandwich, which will change the location of the stitching line we've sewn. We will move the machine around to baste the edges. And when we're done advancing the quilt, the computer will have no idea where the heck the lines of stitching that we've already sewn are located. So we have to make a registration mark that we'll use to show Quilt Path where we've moved everything. Remember when we were talking about stacking boxes or rows of pattern? Well, we need to mark a corner of the box we will be sewing next so that we can find that corner after we advance the fabric. We have three choices: move to top left, move to top center, and move to top right. The best choice here is top center. As we stitch a quilt, the fabric draws up and contracts a bit. Plus, sometimes borders can be a bit wavy, and the borders may not be the most stable portion of a quilt top. The center portion of a quilt is generally the most stable, so we want to use the center to make our mark. Tap on Move to Top Center, and Quilt Path will move the machine to the top center of the next row to be stitched. We need to mark this position. We have lots of choices on how to mark this spot. We could make a dot with an air erasable pen, but I like to just slide a piece of painter's tape under the hopping foot and use the single stitch button in the toolbox to poke a hole in it. You could also just use the single stitch button on your APQS machine. Once you've made your registration mark, you can release the carriage, advance the quilt, base the sides, and get ready to stitch another row. There is no need to flip the carriage clamps to completely release the belts. You can keep them engaged and use the machine as you would usually do to base the sides. The machine will move differently to you, but all we're doing is basting the sides, so it really doesn't matter. Once you are ready, tap on Continue with Placement. Quilt Path asks, are you sure you have marked the fabric and are ready to proceed? Tap Yes. Remember that hole we poked in the painter's tape? Move your machine to that hole. You may want to rotate the flywheel a bit so your needle just grazes the tape to be sure you have the needle positioned over the hole. Now we need to tell Quilt Path that this position, this spot on our table and our quilt is the center top of our next box we've stacked and are about to stitch. Tap the center button with the yellow flag. You'll see the placement screen turn white and our whole row we are about to stitch is displayed. If you are squeamish, you could tap on Trace to be sure you've placed the row correctly. I'm feeling good about everything, so I'm going to tap on Pull Bobbin, and as the machine moves to the start point of the row, I'll just lift up on the painter's tape to get it out of the way. You can reuse this tape a number of times by positioning it in a new spot under the hopping foot the next time you need to mark your top center when it is time to advance again. That's all there is to stitching out a panto. Simple and easy. Of course, there's a lot of finessing and options we could do here too. For example, when we get to the end of a row and need to advance, instead of using our top center position to lay down our painter's tape and make a registration hole, we could ask Quilt Path to tap on Move to Top Left. Once there, we could tap on Make a Corner Mark, and Quilt Path will use basting stitches to make a right angle. We'd advance the quilt as before, but when we were ready to start the row, we'd tap on Continue with Placement and move the machine to the corner mark and press the right-hand button with the yellow flag. However, it's really hard to see that corner mark when you are using fluffy batting like I am here. Plus, the edges of a quilt may be wavy and those sides just can't be trusted as much as the middle. When using the top center for our registration mark, we could also hit the single stitch button, release the carriage, pull the bobbin thread to the top, being sure to pull out at least 12 inches of bobbin thread, then move the machine to a position about 6 inches away, and, if you have a millennium, use your bobbin thread cutter to cut your bobbin. If you have another type of APQS machine, you'll just have to make another single stitch, only this time snip the bobbin thread when you bring it up to the top. You've essentially skewered the top center position with a big piece of thread. The long piece of bobbin can travel with the quilt sandwich as you advance the quilt, or place a mark where the bobbin thread is with a marker. It is up to you how you'd like to mark the position. If you'd ever like to get a bird's eye view of which row you are stitching, tap on the Panto Stacker placement window to see the pattern map. If you tap on the plus or minus buttons, you can select a different row to stitch, but keep in mind that you'll need to place the pattern again if you select a different row. Quilt Path will alert you if you select a different row than it is expecting, so you can cancel out if need be. Tap on Back to exit out of the pattern map area. We've talked about using the upper left or center position of the row's box using the yellow flag buttons. By the way, the only thing that yellow flag on the placement button means is that we want to place the pattern without any distortion. When you get to the last row of your quilt, you can use the distortion buttons to slightly stretch the pattern to fit in the final row of the quilt. To do this, mark your top center position as you would normally do, then move your machine to the bottom left corner of the quilt, and tap on the bottom left distortion button. It looks a little funky now, but wait until we get that bottom right corner in the proper position. Move the machine to the bottom right corner and tap the bottom right distortion button. You have perfectly sized the motif to fit in the final space you have for your last row. There are many ways to advance a quilt inside Quilt Path. Be sure to play and find the way you like best.